No panicking, please. You do not have to memorize these dates, although you should know which cultures and therefore which general periods produced the art we're studying. So in my last lecture, I mentioned that the Crusades and the Mongol invasions, two major threats to a somewhat unified Islamic world, served as a dividing point in Islamic history, or as dividing points. I've talked about the Mamluks and the Ottomans. Now we move further east to look at later flourishing of Islamic art in Persia, now Iran, and the Indian subcontinent. In the 13th century, the Mongols, under the leadership of Genghis Khan, swept out of their bleak mountain home and conquered huge swaths of Eurasia. I should say mountain plain. Throughout the period we refer to as the High Middle Ages in the West, the 11th and 12th centuries, Baghdad was probably the largest city in the world, with an estimated population of over 1 million people. It was the capital of the Abbasid Empire and the greatest center of Islamic learning. The Mongols pretty much wrecked it. This is a 14th century Persian painting of the siege. Note the siege tower and the catapult. The Mongol Empire rather quickly fell apart when Genghis Khan's grandson squabbled. One branch went on to rule China, another, whose art we'll look at later today, ruled India. The Mongols who ruled Persia and a swath of Central Asia converted to Islam and actually created some spectacularly beautiful art and architecture, which does not show up in our list of required works. But here are some samples. The miniature painting on the left shows the dedication of a Timurid rug. The Timurid dynasty met defeat at the hands of a new Persian dynasty, the Safavids. The Safavids were Shia Muslims. In 1598, they established their capital at Isfahan, circled here. So let's watch a video clip about Isfahan, which also gives a glimpse of life in the modern-day Shiite Islamic Republic of Iran. Here's the Shah Mosque, built by the Safavid ruler Shah Abbas. Note the vast courtyard and the extraordinarily complex tile work. Isfahan is unusual in that it has two large congregational mosques. This is the newer one, in the square you saw in the video, outside the old commercial center of Isfahan. But this is not our required work. Instead, the College Board chose a mosque with a much longer history. This, too, is a Friday or congregational or Jame mosque. That's what Jame means. And it was built in the city's commercial center. The oldest part of the mosque was built by Abbasid Arabs in the 8th century on top of a Sassanid Zoroastrian fire temple. We've seen this before in Cordoba, right? After a fire, the mosque was rebuilt by the Seljuk Turks, who ruled Persia before the Mongols. Is this confusing enough? In the process, the Jame Mosque evolved from an Arab hypostyle mosque modeled on Muhammad's house, we've seen those, to a 4-Iwan plan that reflected the influence of earlier Sasanian architecture. Now, the original term Iwan was actually related to the Apadana, remember the audience hall at Persepolis, and it referred to its openness to the elements on one side. The Sasanians added the innovation of domed Iwans. You see remnants of such an Iwan here. Now, this superb mihrab was added to the Jame Mosque in Isfahan after the Mongol conquest and is one of your required images. I've included a close-up of some of the delicate scroll work, which you'll note contains both arabesques and calligraphy. The tile on the upper right dates from the Timurid period. Just a quick aside about tile. Your reading talked about two kinds of Islamic tile work. On the upper left, you see cut tile. Basically, the patterns are created by cutting pieces of tile and then piecing them together into elaborate geometric patterns. Elaborately painted tiles, often with flower patterns, were much more typical of later Islamic art, especially art from the Ottoman Empire, which is still famous, or Turkey is still famous, for these painted decorative tiles. The southeast Iwan, perhaps the most iconic portion of the Isfahan Jame Mosque, dates from the Seljuk era, but it was remodeled with elaborate tiling by the Safavids. I don't know to what extent, by the way, you have to keep all of this straight, but I do think you're expected to understand that this was a mosque that evolved over a period of time and reflected the artistic changes of each of these periods. Now, this mosque plan isn't one of your required images, but you see the large central courtyard flanked by the Iwans. Note that the prayer halls remain hypostyle, and although this isn't one of your required works, I have included a photo on the left. One of the greatest artifacts from Isfahan actually now resides in the Metropolitan Museum of Art. It's not on our list, but it has shown up on a number of previous AP tests, so it's going to show up on your unit test. Note that the mihrab has 3 different sections of calligraphy, or 3 different kinds. So I've talked about how the Iwan mosque style evolved from ancient Persian traditions. The art of Muslim Persia, under its complicated and confusing series of rulers that I keep throwing at you, also harked back to the legends of ancient Persia. And in doing so, it departed from Islamic distrust of zoomorphic images. Now, again, remember, these are secular works you're going to see, but many of them have some religious content, and they still use animal and human figures. The Shahnameh, or Book of Kings, is the Persian national epic poem. It recounts the history of Persia or Iran from creation until the Muslim conquest. It has 50,000 rhyming couplets, which makes it one of the longest epics in world literature. The version of the poem, which was written down in around 1000 CE, or this illustrated version of the poem, was produced under one of the Mongol Khanates. The new Mongol court imported many Chinese works and probably Chinese artists who had a long established tradition of narrative painting, and they also brought a revolutionary technology, which I've talked about before. It was paper. The new rulers encouraged book production, and they developed an interest in historical writings, perhaps to suggest that there was a parallel between themselves and Persia's ancient kings. We've seen this attempt to grab past glory for present legitimacy before. So this scene shows Bahram Gur disguised as an envoy of the Shah of Iran. Bahram Gur made his way to the court of Hind in order to observe the kingdom and its troops. In other words, he was a spy. One evening after a big banquet, Bahram Gur made the mistake of showing what a skilled warrior he was. The king of Hind became suspicious and tried to trick him into revealing his identity. When this attempt to deceive Bahram Gur failed, the king of Hind sent him off to slay a Karg, which was illustrated as a fearsome horned wolf. Does this, by the way, remind you of any other set of legends? Sounds a lot like Hercules to me. At any rate, Bahram Gur killed the wolf with arrows and cut off his head with a sword. Bahram Gur, by the way, became Bahram V, and he figures prominently both in Persian history and in Persian legend. So why do you think the College Board chose this work? And by the way, a lot of my fellow teachers are surprised by this, if chat on the teacher listserv is to be believed. Well, I think the most likely answer is that this cosmopolitan court had trading ties with China and with Europe, and we see influence from both. The resemblance to Chinese landscape painting will be clearer when we get to that, just before Christmas. Bahram Gur, moreover, is wearing a robe made of European fabric. The painting also uses a technique that was beginning to emerge in European painting: atmospheric perspective, where the colors, especially of the sky, become lighter as an object is farther away. So here's a slide that illustrates that. We'll talk about this more when we get to the Renaissance. We don't have any Islamic pottery on our list, but I thought I'd show you this Persian bowl because it features Bahram Gur again, together with a slave girl who was unwise enough to criticize him. If you look below the camel's feet, you will see that she came to a bad end. So here's another page from a different edition of the Shahnameh, produced 200 years later under the Safavids. The story that this painting illustrates comes from the first portion of the Shahnameh, the creation story. It shows the first king, Dayumars, enthroned before his community. His followers are dressed in leopard furs and skins, his son's on the left and his grandson on his right. But in fact, as the readers of this epic would know, a demon has foretold that his son will die. So this is actually a Persian tale of the fall, if you will, the entry of sin and sorrow into the universe. Note that it's set in a kind of paradise where people and animals gather together in peace. It's a Persian version, if you will, of the Garden of Eden. Now, these close-ups give you some sense of the extraordinarily complex and detailed brushwork and the composition of this work. Note the spirits and demons tucked into the pastel rock formations. I think that's very cool. So let's return to our Islamic art and architecture video for a discussion of Persian painting, not these particular works, but a discussion of that painting and how it represented a very different strain in Islamic art. The clip continues on to talk about carpets, which is a good lead into our final Persian work. Ah, these extraordinary carpets. I love them. When my husband and I were in Jerusalem a few years ago, we spent a very fun day in the Muslim quarter hunting for and purchasing a carpet for our living room. Trust me, it was not in this class, not in our budget. This is, in fact, one of a pair of carpets that were first placed in a mosque in Ardabil in northwest Iran. Ardabil is home to the shrine of Sheikh Ardabil, a Sufi leader who trained his followers in Islamic mystic practices, a kind of Islamic Saint Teresa, if you will. One of his descendants founded the Safavid dynasty, and the Safavids promoted the shrine as a place of pilgrimage. So once again, we're seeing a symbol of the union of political and religious power, a way to gain legitimacy by association with religion. At any rate, it was a much visited shrine, and over time the carpets became heavily worn. In 1890, a British carpet broker bought both and used one to restore the other. That's somewhat controversial now. He then resold the restored carpet to Victoria and Albert Museum. You see it exhibited here. Fragments of the others are displayed in a number of different places, including the Getty Museum in Los Angeles. There's an inscription at the bottom that reads, "I have no refuge in the world other than thy threshold. There is no protection for my head other than this door. The work of the slave of the threshold, Maqsad of Kashan in the year 946. By the way, that's 946 according to the Muslim calendar, 1539 in the calendar of the West. So here again, you see the elaborate geometric forms and the arabesques or stylized plant stems and tendrils. The foundation of the carpet is silk warp and weft tied to a vertical loom. The weavers then knotted short lengths of wool around the warps to create a roll of pile. When the whole roll was finished, they inserted 3 rows of weft over it and under the warps to hold the knots in place, and then the pile was packed down with a special comb-like beater. This would be better to show you on video, but I don't have one. So finally, the pile was trimmed with special scissors to achieve a uniform length. This process was repeated over and over again until the huge carpet was finished, when a final trimming would take place. The pile itself is made from wool, which holds dye much better than silk. The pile is very dense, about 340 knots per square inch. This density allowed the designer to incorporate a great deal more detail, but making such a large carpet with so many knots would have taken a team of skilled weavers several years. By the way, most carpet weaving was done at home by women. We'll see that pattern in textiles throughout this course. But for a court commission such as this, the weavers may have been men. Okay, I think that's all I should try to fit onto this podcast. One more to go as we travel east to Mughal India.